So I think this is my great honor to have Chris as our EMSL Xchange presentation speaker today. So Chris is a professor at the Department Chair in Civil and Environmental Engineering, and also Associate Dean of Graduate Students and Online Education at the UC Davis. I think most of people may be familiar with Chris, that Chris is a very world famous aerosol scientist, and he did a lot of work, impact our field a lot. I want to specifically mention that Chris did a lot of work on the water effect on the aerosol optical property, which inspired myself a lot. And his paper is one of the first paper I read in my PhD studies, and also that's impacted by a lot of work I did. And today we have Chris to give us a talk on the influence of water on light absorption by atmospheric particles. And please join me in welcome Chris as our speaker. Sorry, forget one thing. If the online people have a question, please feel free to put in the chat, and I will monitor that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you so much for the chance to come up here and visit the lab and meet with a lot of you. And hello to everybody online as well. I'm a big fan of art. I'd like to pick something that reflects a little bit what I'm going to talk about. So we got nice big blue blobs of water there. So what I'm going to talk about for the most part today is thinking about how not just water impacts optical properties, particles, but specifically how water uptake on particles impacts light absorption, which I would argue has been a bit understudied, certainly relative to how water impacts extinction. So to give an overview of what I'll be talking about today, I'm going to start with talking a little bit about the past year and what I'd say think we know, but we've got a pretty good handle now on what we know about light absorption by dry aerosols next to whether it's black carbon or brown carbon. There's always more things to learn, but we're getting a good handle on a lot of this. I want to summarize a little bit of that because it'll lead into thinking then about the impact of water uptake on aerosol absorption. And so we'll talk a little bit about why that's important, and in particular why it really hasn't been studied experimentally all that much so far. Think about how we're working to overcome some of those historical experimental hurdles so that we can measure light absorption at elevated humidity. And then we'll talk about some of the experiments that we've been doing and some of the explanations that are coming from that and how that links to the unique things that water can do to particles relative to some other components overall. But I want to start by thanking the people who've contributed to this work over the years. This is an incomplete list, but some of the people who've really contributed at UC Davis. The two people most involved here are Rachel Porto. She graduated this past December, and then Zoom Zhang, who's been doing a lot of the work that I'll be talking about today, but also others at UC Davis, Chen Wang, Qi Zhang, here at EMSL, Laura Fierce, and then Paradigm as well, Tim Nash, Andy Friedman. But really, a lot of the experimental work today is from Rachel and Zuin here. So big picture, things that we all already know, right, is that atmospheric particles really do have a strong net cooling effect on global climate, and they do offset some of the warming from greenhouse gases. They do this by scattering sunlight, controlling the properties of clouds, but that overall net cooling effect is a balance between the cooling effect of scattering and the warming effect of absorption, right? And so if we look at absorption, it remains the case. This is an older figure from the IPCC, but I think it's still one of the clearer ones, where we can think about the impacts of absorption and how it offsets that net cooling effect. And it does show through either direct effects, kind of that direct warming overall. It can do do it through its behavior in cloud droplets. It can do it through impacts on clouds overall. So when we want to think about, the impact of aerosols on climate, of course, you have to distinguish between their scattering and their absorption, and then all the ancillary impacts that they have on things like clouds. But these properties, right, these impacts do remain fairly uncertain. And also, I would contend that someday in the future, these uncertainties probably won't matter that much because greenhouse gas concentrations are going to outweigh everything, and who cares what the aerosols are doing. But right now, understanding these really do matter to projecting what the future is going to hold with respect to temperature changes from greenhouse gases, and also understanding the past as well. And so I think we really do need to keep working to break down some of these uncertainties. There's a few things that drive our global the overall uncertainty from absorption in particular. I've categorized these in kind of three general categories here. One is just the understanding of the global distribution of absorbing aerosols, size distributions, where they are, lifetimes, things like that, right? That's something that's super important. That's something that I don't work on directly. I know some of the modelers here do, but really important to nail down concentration distributions. Also really important to understand the impacts of absorption and warming on cloud responses overall, and changes to boundary layer dynamics through rapid adjustments from the heating that can come out. It really also depends on this distribution, the vertical of black and brown carbon everywhere. But the thing that I've been focusing on for quite a few years now is really more on the microphysical properties of particles and how that impacts their absorption, right? What the properties are, what their fundamental absorption components are, and how strongly they absorb, and how that depends on what the particles are made of and how they're mixed with other components. Because one of the things, and I think everybody knows, right, particles are not one thing, many things, right, made of lots and lots of different components that all mix together to give the overall properties. So I'm going to focus on this part for today. Right, one of the things, there's lots of different sources of absorbing aerosols, and this gives rise to lots of different properties as well. And so just some examples here: big fires. These are some fires from California here that we had more recently, but we have kind of more persistent burning around the world for things like cooking. And then we have people like this who just like to spit out smoke because they think it's cool. But lots of different sources here overall. And this gives rise to a whole distribution of different types of absorbing particles. So just to orient all of us, right, break it down into three general types. We've got black carbon over here. This is really the refractory, strongly absorbing components from high temperature combustion in general. We have absorbing organic aerosol, or what's also known as brown carbon here, which is all sorts of things. It's not one thing anymore. It's lots of things. It can be formed from combustion. It can be formed chemically in the atmosphere. It can be chemically transformed in the atmosphere. Its properties are constantly evolving, which makes it exciting and fun to understand, but also challenging to model comprehensively in different ways. But it generally is less absorbing compared to black carbon in general, but with a very steep wavelength dependence. And then we have things like dust over here. Dust, again, depends where it comes from the Sahara or the Gobi Desert, so you're going to have different properties overall. Tends to be weakly absorbing, but because dust concentrations can be huge in regions where you get dust storms, it can still have big global impacts overall. And so understanding the properties of all of these and how they relate to kind of the composition of what we have is one thing that I've been working on. I'm going to focus really on these first two today, black carbon and brown carbon today, and more on black carbon. We're going to touch on brown carbon. So the absorption by even black carbon itself is not constant. We know this quite well now. It's been established for a long time through theory that if you take black carbon particles and you stick them in the middle of other stuff, right, all that other stuff that makes up particles, that other stuff will impact the overall interaction of the particle with solar radiation, and that can lead to an enhancement or increased absorption by that black carbon relative to if it were not coated at all. These enhancements can be very small if the coatings aren't very much, but if you get a bit of coating on there, a decent amount, you can get factors of 2 or more, depending on the size of that carbon. So a factor of 2 change in the absorption just from those coatings overall. And that factor of 2 change overall does have big impacts on climate. And so that was shown back in 2001 by Mark Jacobson, but by many others since then, showing the importance of understanding the impact of these coatings and the mixing state of black carbon. And so the state of things kind of back then was that we think coatings all influence black carbon absorption. And in fact, when we go into the laboratory and we do this, we generate black carbon particles, and then we select those black carbon particles. We're looking at things that we really know and measure what I'll call the absorption enhancement here. So that's going to be the ratio between the absorption that's observed overall, and the theoretical or measured absorption without any coating on it. Right. So we're going to keep in mind that ratio between kind of the what's actually observed versus the no coating case. And what we see, and here's 2 different examples, and others have seen this as well. But we see a clear increase and a strong increase in that absorption enhancement as the amount of coating material increases. These are just 2 different metrics of the amount of coating material there for these single particles. But what we found when we went to the field is that when we look in the field and we look at the magnitude of the absorption enhancement, and these were measurements from around California in this case, as a function of the coating material, suddenly things didn't seem to add up to that theoretical picture. And this was, we saw this back through some field campaigns, and one of them was the DOE CARES campaign back in 2010, I believe. And others have seen this since then. If we start looking around at other campaigns as well, here's some other examples. Kind of a summary, this is non-comprehensive. There's lots of measurements out there now. But in general, if we look at that enhancement, if we look at kind of single particles or monodispersed stuff, we see increases. If we look at other things as well, we see all sorts of behavior where quite often that enhancement is much smaller than we would think. And so we were stumped for a while, and then there was some advances in understanding. This is where I'd say I think we have pretty good understanding now of what that difference is driven by. And that difference is driven by, I'd argue, three things. One is compositional heterogeneity, which is basically just saying not all particles are the same, right? It's driven by the fact that we can have diversity in particle shapes as well, right? In models, we have to make simplifying assumptions, and quite often, the most simplifying assumption in thinking about these enhancements, and it works pretty well for monodispersed particles, is to treat black carbon as if it's just a nice little sphere coated by a sphere, but that's not what real particles necessarily look like. All of the nice imaging work in the lab here has shown that pretty well over time. But also, some of the challenges in the past have just been sometimes we're not characterizing things well, and there's some brown carbon or some dust in there that we haven't accounted for well, and it looks like the black carbon absorbs more than it does. So we've come to understand this in a few ways. This was a nice study from Dantong Liu, where they were able to show that when you increase the amount of coating on individual particles, so we've got the increase in coating going to the right, but there's a very clear change in how they scatter light on a single particle level. And we see this transition when we get to some critical amount of coating. What they interpreted this as, and what they're able to show, is this was really just a change from going from when you don't have a lot of coating, things look more like this, where that black carbon isn't hanging out in the middle of your particle, it's hanging out more on the edge. And when you have black carbon hanging out on the edge, that enhancement is smaller. And then you can go into a region where suddenly you get more of a coated behavior, and you get a much larger enhancement. So that's one piece of the puzzle here, is understanding that not all particles are really spherical or perfectly in this core shell mode. And then some other work here, this is led by Laura Fierce here, is showing that if we take this effect over here, and we account for that, and then we add on top of that this idea that not all particles are the same, Some black carbon has a lot of stuff, some has a little bit of stuff. On average, there's some amount. One of the problems in the past when we were interpreting things is we were comparing apples and oranges in some ways. We were comparing experiments on monodispersed particles, where we know the size and we know the coating amounts very well, to what amount to bulk average coating. Right? We knew that they were coatings, but we didn't account for that diversity between particles. And if you start to account for all of that, suddenly the magnitude of the enhancement goes from this gray line to be the default in this case, to accounting for that deviation in terms of shape, it's this red line, and then accounting for this heterogeneity, right? Not all particles are the same. We get to this orange line, and you combine those, and you get this blue line. And before you know it, we're doing a pretty good job of explaining atmospheric absorption by black carbon particles. Right? So we have to piece all this together. One of the big challenges then is embedding things like this in climate models, because when you have to start dealing with lots of different particles, you can't treat everything the same, it gets harder, right? But it can really help us to explain a lot of this behavior. So I was pretty happy with all that after a while. But the biggest challenge I thought in the end was that we did all these experiments under dry conditions, whether they were the laboratory experiments, whether they were the field experiments, they were all under dry conditions. And that's a problem because water is a major component of atmospheric aerosols. It's a liquid component, and it does different things than a lot of the other components of aerosol. It's much more dynamic in different ways, right? It responds rapidly to changes in relative humidity, right? And we need to understand how water behaves as one of these coating materials and how it might change things. Why might it be different though? Why would I think that it might be different? Well, again, because it's not the same as all these other coating things. Right? We might think if we end up with water as a coating, well, I tend to think of black carbon and things like that as pretty hydrophobic. Right? It's not gonna, it doesn't really want to dissolve in water. And so something that maybe was hanging out in the middle of a particle, it's always possible that if you start adding some water, solubilizing everything, making an aqueous solution out of it, something that black carbon doesn't like to be in the middle of it anymore. Maybe it wants to go to the surface. And what do we know about black carbon on the surface? It's going to decrease that magnitude of that enhancement overall. Right? So we could have things like that going on. We could also have things, if we look at not just black carbon, but if we look at brown carbon, for example, right? So brown carbon absorbing organic aerosol. Well, maybe we have a nice dry brown carbon sample. But if we start to add water and add water and add water, lots of things could happen. One, it could become fully soluble and just dissolve and have a homogeneous droplet. It could be partially soluble and maybe just form a coating itself on that aqueous droplet from some phase separation behavior. Or maybe it goes the other way and it stays more solid and ends up in the middle. Right? Lots of things could happen because water is different. I spent my PhD studying water. I love water. The water is different than a lot of the other coatings that we have. And so it's important that we have a firm understanding of how water behaves and how particles behave and respond to relative humidity in the context of absorption to make sure that we can model things properly. And it's important because things like this nice study here also by Laura as well show that the impact of water can be quite large. So what this is showing here is the magnitude of the absorption enhancement as a function of relative humidity for a somewhat soluble coating and a very soluble coating. But what we see is that when we get up towards these larger humidities, especially, the increase in the enhancement starts to really go up if we assume that the black carbon just stays in the middle, right? So we have to make some assumption about where that black carbon is going, and we don't have yet experimental constraints on it. In the context of looking at absorption, we do have some experimental constraints from things like microscopy, right? So things like the environmental SEM here. So here's an example. This is actually for tar balls, where we can see that some of these tar balls will take up water, right? And they'll end up in different parts of the particles overall, right? So we have some idea that all is not necessarily good stuff to stay in the middle from things like this But we really need experiments that can look at this in terms of how it actually impacts absorption. So that's where I'm going to spend the rest of the time here. But any questions so far? Overview of the past.
I was wondering, you say that black carbon increases or the absorption increases with most coatings. Is there any coatings where you have noticed that this doesn't happen?
As long as we know that the black carbon is in the middle of the particle, we always see the absorption increase. But I think we'll see later today that there's ways to create particles where the black carbon can sit on the surface when it's dry, kind of giving away a little bit later, and that can really impact then what the water can do as well. So what that starting state ends up as the dry state can impact then the influence of what the water could have as well.
So the coating enhances because of the lensing effect is okay.
Yeah, so it's colloquially known as the lensing effect. So you can picture it as you have your little black carbon and you put a coating on it, suddenly the overall particle can capture more light, kind of reflect some of it towards that black carbon. The math is more complicated than that, but that's essentially what's going on. And as Laura knows, unless the refractive index decreases, yes, that's also important in this story later. We'll see that. Thank you. All right. So why haven't we had a strong experimental foundation for light absorption at elevated RH? The answer is because it's hard. It's hard to do, and some of our traditional methods just really couldn't do it. So we have, for example, filter-based methods, whether we collect those filters or do it in situ. Filters are great. They have some biases intrinsically at dry conditions, but then you start to add water and the water starts to alter the properties of those particles on the filter. And before you know it, you're not sure if you're looking at the same thing. And so you really can't do water uptake experiments very well on filters here. So we have to cross those out. It's a big limitation for working at high RH. Photoacoustic spectroscopy, which I use in my lab, is great for dry conditions. But when you start to have a much more volatile component like water, what happens in photoacoustic spectroscopy is basically you shine a laser at the particles, they heat up a little bit. In heating up, you warm the air around it. And when you warm the air, you change the density and it makes a sound. So you make the particles squeak. But if you have water in your particle, this more volatile component, when you heat it up a little bit, instead of heating up the air around it, that water evaporates. And so you basically get a negative bias when you have water. And you never know whether you're actually negatively biased or whether you're observing something real. And so you can't trust photoacoustic spectroscopy at higher RH, especially because of that evaporation bias. So these two, I think, have big limitations to the point where they just won't work. The other way that people have gotten at absorption is absorption by difference. So you'll measure light extinction and you'll measure light scattering, take the difference between those and you get absorption. And that works, except for now you have two measurements. You have to take the difference and the uncertainties of those two measurements propagate together. And if you want to measure small differences in absorption, you have to do that really carefully and really well. And so that is a big challenge, right? But it's only a challenge. It's not inherently going to mean that you can't do the measurement. There's nothing intrinsic about the water uptake that is going to cause a problem. That's just a challenge of the method as a whole. And so we can work to overcome that. And in fact, I'd say in the past decade or so, there have been some big advances there where basically, historically, you have your scattering instrument, your extinction instrument, maybe two different instruments. You never know if the relative humidity is exactly the same or if you're looking at exactly the same thing. Well, some clever people managed to shove those things together, and you can do extinction and scattering measurements on exactly the same sample simultaneously, right? So no longer, at least, you have to worry about differences in what you're sampling, differences in RH. Those are all now exactly the same. So you take away that issue. Now you just have to worry about getting those two measurements as accurate as possible, or at least as precise as possible. We want to measure the changes. And so this is the method that we're going to pursue here. And I'm not going to talk too much about how we do this, but well, the approach that we've taken is we've partnered here, we've worked with Aerodyne Research, who make a commercial instrument called the CAPS SSA, and it integrates extinction measurements using they call it cavity attenuated phase shift spectroscopy, which is an absolute method in general, very stable, very precise. So that's really nice. And then integrated with that is an integrating nephelometer that operates on the same sample. So we can get scattering by integrated nephelometry on the same sample. So they have this instrument. What we did is we modified the instrument so that it could have both precise and stable temperature control of that entire cell where it's working in the end. Because fluctuations, I'm sure those fluctuations in temperature are killers anytime that you're trying to do measurements at elevated RH. You need to have really stable temperature and relative humidity. It took us a little while to figure out how to do that and not mess up the other measurements, but we got there. And then also we had to build a humidification system. So we have a humidification system so we can go between dry conditions or all the way up to 90+% RH. I think we can get up to 95% or so without worrying too much about condensation. We can do really long. We can either ramp the RH up and down, or we can just go back and forth between dry and wet conditions in the end. So it took us a little while to get this instrument working, disrupted by a pandemic, so many things, but it is working now very nicely. However, there's one more challenge here that we have to overcome, and that is that the extinction measurement, very stable, it's basically independent of whatever you're doing. Scattering, though, has an additional complication. With scattering, the challenge is you're trying to collect all of the scattered light. That's impossible to do if you want to let your laser in, right? You got to let your laser in and out, and then so you're going to miss some of that scattered light. So you can't do that. That's an effect called truncation. And so you have to correct for this effect of truncation to get your scattering measurement made well. We can do that quite well in general. We can calibrate things. We can work to do that. However, there's a challenge that when you start to work with water, right, and water uptake, you're starting to change the particle size. And this truncation correction that you need depends on particle size. So you start with one value, start to grow your particles, and that truncation keeps changing. So you have to figure out how to dynamically account for that, figure out exactly how much did my particle change in size from that water uptake, which you don't necessarily know independently. You should measure the growth factors independently, the whole separate instrument. And so we deal with this issue because the truncation correction is increasing with particle size, but it also depends on particle composition. Right, so as you're taking up water, you're typically decreasing the refractive index relative to anything else that you have. And when you do that, you also change the scattering properties overall and the truncation correction overall. And so you can have things where we have to account for all of this. And if anybody's interested in the details, I can go through it later. But in general, what we did is we developed an experimentally constrained recursive RH-dependent truncation correction that basically we can use the extinction to think about how the particles grow. We can think about that to figure out the size, which we can think about the truncation correction, which we can feed back in a loop and do this a few times to think about the refractive index changes. And by the time that we're done, we can get what we believe are very great corrections that are essentially independent of the relative humidity and the growth that we have. It still helps to work with smaller size particles where truncation is smaller, but we can do this up to many hundreds of microns quite well. Not microns, nanometers. So we can get what we believe are accurate measurement of RH and absorption, extinction, and scattering now. And that absorption is the key thing. We've been able to do extinction and scattering reasonably well for a long time. And so now we can measure what I'm calling here the RH absorption enhancement, right? With the extinction and scattering, we've often called these F of RH or F of extinction. So here now we're going to add into this our FMRH for absorption here, which we're going to define as the ratio between the wet absorption that you observe and then the perfectly dry absorption. We're going to keep that in mind here. That's going to be our definition here. And just to prove to you that this works, when we do this for ammonium sulfate, and this is an average over like 15 different sizes from 50 nanometers up to I think 500 nanometers as the dry diameter particle. We do this for ammonium sulfate, which is non-absorbing, takes up water. We find that we get an RH independent single scatter albedo of 1, which is exactly what it should be for ammonium sulfate. You take up water. We see that the derived refractive indices that we get from this and the growth factors that we get. So here's a derived growth factor over here, are consistent with the literature. So we can quantitatively even derive the growth factors. And we observe this very sharp deliquescence behavior at the right values as we would expect to see for ammonium sulfate. So we're pretty confident that the instrument is working well. And now we can actually measure differences in absorption for absorbing samples. All right. Okay, so what role does water play? So it's going to depend on the presence of non-absorbing hygroscopic components. And that's one thing. If you have no hygroscopic components, there's going to be no water uptake, and then you don't care. You have to have some coating to begin with for this to matter when you're dealing with black carbon. If you're dealing with brown carbon, maybe it takes up water itself a little bit. Right? But you have to have, so it's going to depend on the presence of other hygroscopic components. It might depend on things like phase partitioning, and it might depend on things like morphology. All right. We've tested this so far using 2 different atmospheric aerosol analogs. So the first is fullerene soot, which is our black carbon analog. So fullerene soot is an insoluble solid component, strongly absorbing, has a lot of similarities to atmospheric black carbon. It's not exactly the same, but it has a lot of similarity here overall. And then we're going to use as our brown carbon surrogate compound called nigrosine here. It's not exactly brown carbon. You can see it's an anionic species here, so it's a bit different than what you might get from biomass burning. But it has properties like it's moderately soluble overall. It's somewhat absorbing across the visible range, so we can use it at least as a starting point, and it's very easy to work with to its real benefits in the end. So we're going to consider these 2 atmospheric aerosol analogs, one really our black carbon mimic and one our brown carbon mimic. And what we're going to do is we're going to take these and we're going to mix them with something soluble. We're going to use ammonium sulfate, which is one of the most common inorganic components that we see, mixed with these in the atmosphere. Okay, so we're going to mix these in different ways. All right. And so I'm going to start here. I'm going to start with the nigrosine here. So let's start by thinking. So the types of experiments that we do is we generate size-selected mixed nigrosine and ammonium sulfate particles. We do this for 10 different sizes. What we're going to look at here are averages across those 10 different sizes in the end. And we can start by saying, okay, just for reference, is our behavior for ammonium sulfate. Again, we get that sharp deliquescence behavior, an increase in extinction. We don't get absorption, so it's not on there overall. But that's our reference. And then we can see for nigrosine, now what we see for pure nigrosine, we see the extinction increase, right? The F of RH for extinction here is somewhat above 1, slightly above 1, meaning it's taking up water, but not a lot of water, but it is taking up water. And what we see here then is that influence of that taking up water is leading to a small, about 5 to 10% increase in the absorption by the nigrosine particles itself. The nigrosine starts with some absorption, we humidify it, it continuously takes up water here, and the absorption increases by a little bit, 5 or 10% here. And so that gives us some sense of the magnitude of the potential impact and the reference for just pure nigrosine. We add a bit of ammonium sulfate. So in this case, we've got nigrosine as dominant. and ammonium sulfate is in the minority here, we see it's about the same. We've added a bit more, we've added a bit when this value goes up here, that's saying it's taking up more water, but the impact on absorption hasn't changed much. Okay. But what we also see here is that we have some ammonium sulfate there, but we do not see this deliquescent behavior at all. So one thing we observe is it suppresses that deliquescent behavior overall. So ammonium sulfate isn't behaving like ammonium sulfate anymore. Tells us something about what the properties of the particles have to be. If we add a bit more ammonium sulfate, well, it's the same ratio, but add a bit more still, about the same behavior. We see a little more water uptake, still small absorption increase, hasn't really changed much. We're starting to see some hints here, maybe of deliquescent behavior, pre-deliquescent behavior as ammonium sulfate starts to become a bigger component. We add a little bit more, that deliquescent behavior, pre-deliquescent behavior starts to become more apparent. Start to see then some strange things going on down here with the absorption, where it was first increased, it decreases a little bit, and then goes back up. Then if we add a little more even ammonium sulfate, suddenly we see very different behavior overall. So we've added even more ammonium sulfates. Now we're ammonium sulfate dominated. See pretty sharp deliquescent behavior coming in here overall. And suddenly for absorption, what we see is almost no enhancement from water uptake, right, at lower values. And suddenly when we hit that deliquescent point, suddenly the enhancement goes up, and it goes up by more than it did for those other cases, quite a bit more as well. We're seeing that the behavior, right, the response of these particles or the influence of water depends on what the composition is, even for this binary mixture, right? There's not one answer. How can we understand this? Well, we can turn to, in this case, we can turn to the literature and think about how we might expect a two-component organic, inorganic system to behave. And we can think about the fact that such particles can undergo what's referred to as liquid-liquid phase separation. And this is on the left, so this is from key paper from Ellen. Over here, quite often that crystalline component in the orange and red here might end up excluding that organic component on the outside, right? They might have two different phases, even under dry conditions. Then when you start to add water, you start to add a bit of water, so that we'll call this medium relative humidity. You take up some water, most of that water goes to the inorganic phase, but that organic part stays on the outside, right? You get this two-phase system with an aqueous inorganic rich core and an organic rich coating that has a lot less water. But if you keep increasing the relative humidity even more, at some point you can break down, you can kind of overcome that phase separation behavior. You have enough water and suddenly everything just mixes together into one big homogeneous phase. So that's the basic picture. We know that we can get these different behaviors. We know that this depends on the organic to inorganic ratio of this behavior. So illustrating that here on the right, so I made kind of cartoon versions from this Bertram paper, where if we think about the relative humidity at which you kind of separate between this well-mixed liquid particle and the aqueous salt core. So the relative humidity where you transition between that relative humidity, when you have lower organic to sulfate ratios in general, you tend to see that behavior, right? You'll see a difference between where you get a phase separated system versus a well-mixed system above that relative humidity. So below that, you phase separated, above that, you get well-mixed. But if you keep increasing the amount of organic over here, and eventually you do not see any of that phase separation at all, right? So it depends on that. It also can tell you this organic sulfate mass ratio will tell you whether the particles will deliquesce at all, right? Or whether you don't see deliquescence, or even whether you will see efflorescence as well, right? Which is kind of that telltale sign of crystallization of that inorganic core here, versus if you see no deliquescence or efflorescence when you dry, then it probably means that you're maintaining a homogeneous mixture that entire time as you dry. So we know that there's this dependence on what you have here, and that's exactly what we saw, right? We saw that when the organic amount is low and the sulfate is high, we saw deliquescent behavior, right? And when it was low, we saw very different behavior here. So we can start to try to explain this actually through modeling now. Right? We can use optical models to explain this. And so in this case, we're explaining this overall with two. Well, we use three models here to consider, but we're going to use just two of them here. That makes most sense. One is when we have our high organic, high nitrogen to ammonium sulfate ratios. So where the organic's dominating. Well, in this case, we're saying we don't get deliquescence or efflorescence, right? We also don't really get phase separation, right? So we can go from what I'd say is a homogeneous condition to a homogeneous condition with a bit of water to a homogeneous condition with a bit more water, right? So we're just homogeneous the whole way through. And if we model that using meat theory in this case, we see that the well-mixed model does quite well in terms of matching the observation. That's generally true for all those conditions. I'm just showing one example here at high nitrogen, but it works pretty well. We flip the case here, right? And then you can see that well-mixed model, the cyan line, does not explain things very well anymore, right? Doesn't explain the magnitude of that enhancement. And instead, what we need to invoke is a case where the dry particle, right, has an inorganic core with an organic, in this case, nitrogen shell. We add a bit of water, we maintain that phase separation, right? And then we add a bit more water, and suddenly you get that homogeneous mixture, and that's where you see this large increase overall. So we're seeing this phase behavior playing out in terms of how it impacts optical properties overall. So it suggests that we need to account for these types of behaviors to some extent within models, especially, I would argue, thinking about not just how going this way impacts things, which is what we're doing, but how drying things out impacts things. Because a lot of times we emit stuff down low where it's warm and moist, and then it gets carried up to where it's much drier. So in many ways, it's the reverse process that matters more. Any questions? Yeah.
But on the previous slide, this might not be a detail that's worth diving into, but there's that kind of like moderate decrease in absorption at more moderate relative humidity values. Is that something that is worth diving into, or is there a good logical explanation for why that behavior kind of starts and then seemingly goes away?
It's been a little bit harder to understand. We suspect it's probably because we're somewhere, we haven't mapped this out. We have about 6 points, right? We haven't mapped this out with a lot of points here, but we're probably somewhere in this transition region where small changes the behavior might not be. So we think that that's hanging out in that transition regime. All right. All right, so what about the black carbon analog here, fullerene sit? So let's turn to that. And here, we're going to go through kind of a similar exercise here, where we mix our fullerene sit with ammonium sulfate. We'll start where the fullerene is dominant. What we see in this case is that we see reasonable deliquescent behavior, even at the larger, I won't call it organic in this case, but BC to inorganic ratio. We still see a deliquescent behavior with some water uptake here, and small increases, maybe 5% increase in the absorption from that water uptake. We add a bit more ammonium sulfate, so now in this case a 1-to-1 mixture. See a little more water uptake. The absorption enhancement doesn't change very much at all. And then if we add even more ammonium sulfate, well, suddenly we see a much bigger increase in particle size from that dashed line. And in fact, the enhancement in this case is off the charts, and it's off the charts because it's way up here. It jumps way up to more like 2 or 2.5 from water uptake in this case. So we're seeing In this case, not just a small change like the brown carbon. We're seeing a massive change in behavior with composition. We'll look at this here in this kind of high RH range here, and we did this for more experiments. And what we find when we look in this range is so the orange points are that RH absorption enhancement, and the green points are the water uptake, the growth factor. So as the fluorine soot mass fraction goes down, ammonium sulfate goes up, we take up more water, the growth factors go up, and we go through what seems to be kind of this pretty sharp transition. Again, we're seeing this kind of transition type behavior where we go from modest enhancements over on this side, 5 to 20%, to suddenly up to factors of 2 or more here, right? So big differences. So how could this be the case? So first thing we did is we're like, well, would this be expected based on core shell theory, kind of that standard way of modeling things? If we just take a dry black carbon particle, put a dry coating around it, and then make that coating bigger when we add water. Does that explain things? And the answer is not at all, right? Not at all. We in fact see that when if we do this and we go from a dry particle to a wet particle, the enhancement that we calculate goes up a little bit as the fluorine fraction goes down, and then it goes down again. Okay? It goes up and then down in the end. It goes up on these high fluorine fractions, right? Because one thing we need to think about is that we're looking at the enhancement from the water. There is already an enhancement from just the coating itself. So over on this side where fluorine soot is dominant, that initial enhancement is small. You could potentially add a bigger enhancement, but you don't have a lot of stuff take up the water. They don't take up a lot of water to drive that enhancement. And then we move to this other side, and suddenly that amount of coating goes up a lot. And that amount of coating might be a factor of 2 by itself in terms of the enhancement. So you add a bunch of water to it, it doesn't actually change things very much. Plus, you've changed the refractive index with the coating, which also decreases the enhancement over here. So the core shell model clearly fails, right? So we wanted to think about alternative models here and how we can explain this. And so we turned here to the literature. This is some work from Adati et al. And others have done calculations like this. But basically thinking about, how do actual soot particles behave, right? So 1, soot is not necessarily a sphere, right? 2, these particles don't necessarily exist in this core shell state. It might be that the soot exists on the surface, right? So we can think about things like on the top here, right? They did some calculations using some higher level theory where they can look at the absorption relative to that of uncoated soot. So this is just kind of, from bare black carbon to coated black carbon, you can get large enhancements, right? If you add more and more coatings. So we can account for that. If we think about whether we have a black carbon that exists more as kind of chains and fluffy structures as we might get for fresh stuff versus if it collapses into more of a sphere-ish type thing, right? That's going to affect the absorption overall. And in fact, we find that, core shell-like thing over here, as we change to a more fluffy extended structure like this, still coated, right? But the absorption goes down. So that was the state. And then we can also account for the idea that, well, this soot, whether it's a fluffy extended state or whether it's more of a sphere, hangs out in the center of the particle over here, or whether it hangs out more like on the edge over here. And if it's more on the edge, the absorption goes down. And I think they didn't even go as far as you might if you really stuck that right far on the edge over here. They still have it somewhat embedded overall. So we know that these things can happen right overall. And so we, or Zuin, really developed kind of an empirical model to account for all of this and then modify our calculations to think about how this could happen. He did this by considering a few simplistic cases here where we have an open chain or a bigger sphere, kind of a surface chain, what do you call it, center chain or a packed chain. So that's more class 1 or this classic core shell. You can consider all the permutations of these under dry states or wet states and how they might change. And so if we do this, so this is, there's a lot to follow here. Each one of these, same data, just a different model, right? Different model assumption. So this is that core shell, but we can also say surface bound, it's wet. We could say embedded to still embedded, but wet, right? Lots of different cases. In all of these cases, what we see is that the enhancements that we get are relatively modest, right? And I started to view that as when the internal organization of the black carbon relative to the coating is preserved on humidification, right? You don't get a big enhancement from the water, right? In essence, the black carbon needs to move around to get a big enhancement. And that's in fact what we find if he says, okay, if we use a dry state where that black carbon is on the surface now, not in the middle, right? It goes to a case where it's in the wet case somehow, for whatever reason, that black carbon wants to hang out in the middle of this wet aqueous solution, which that I still don't understand why it would want to do that. But it starts to explain the observations a bit more. And if we push this further to the edge, to the point where we pretend that it's basically barely touching the other part of the particle, it's essentially not coated at all. This is kind of your upper limit that you make that here, right? That's the limiting case. And we can start to explain the magnitude of the enhancements that we have. So this is really saying that we can end up with these large enhancements from water uptake, but only if that black carbon in the coating were really hanging out on the surface, barely connected anymore, which could happen through processes like coagulation in the atmosphere, for example. So if we combine these kind of two models and think about it as a transition, we might say that we go from a case where when we have fluorine soot dominating the coatings in this case, and it is possible, I'll just say it's possible this is an artifact of how we generated the particles. We want to understand how general this might be. But we go from kind of, I'll call it internal organization is maintained. Doesn't really matter how it's maintained, it just needs to be maintained. And we can end up with these smaller values. And then we have to go from a surface bound to a center orientation transition as the fluorine soot becomes a much smaller component of the overall particle here in the end. And so we see, I'd say with the black carbon, we were definitely surprised by this. My assumption was that we'd see small enhancements down here. I'd say, see, black carbon lives on the surface of the water. It doesn't do anything, but instead we're seeing these large enhancements. Okay, so I'll wrap up here. So to summarize, right, I think we have a pretty good handle on the behavior of dry particles at black carbon pretty well in explaining the observations that depends on mixing states and internal morphology quite a lot. When we look at our brown carbon or partially soluble absorbing aerosol, we need to start accounting for things like liquid phase separation. And I've seen some papers that are talking about this and doing calculations in different ways. And now we're able to observe the direct impacts on absorption that can help validate some of those calculations overall. And in fact, we see larger effects of RH-induced enhancements when we get that liquid phase separation behavior, which happens when we have kind of low organic ratios. And then for black carbon, we have our insoluble absorbing aerosol. It really depends strongly on the dry particle morphology is what we find. To get a large enhancement from water, in essence, what we're seeing is you have to have a small enhancement from that coating initially. If that coating is dominating the enhancement to begin with, then water can't do all that much more. Because either you have too little coating to take up much water, or you have so much coating it's dominating the enhancement. So you have these two levers, and it's only if you get these morphologies where the BC sits on the surface, you can get very large enhancements induced by water uptake overall. So up next, we want to do things like organic plus inorganic plus black carbon mixtures because that represents the atmosphere a bit more. Overall, we want to think about particle generation methods and things like using real flame generated black carbon that we then coat through gas phase condensation in different ways to access different morphological cases here overall and see how generalizable some of these effects might prove to be. thank the people who worked it. Thank everybody for your time. I appreciate it.
So we still have a few minutes for questions. So I want to ask if any questions from online folks. You can unmute and ask the questions. Online folks are very happy. Okay. Is there any question from the room?
So, nice experiment you did there. What was the size of the particles you looked at when you have the soot and the sulfate, It's,
So these are all averages across about 10 different sizes. So I think we work from usually where the overall particle diameter would be anywhere from 75 nanometers to 500 nanometers. And so the size of the black carbon core varies as we change the black carbon to inorganic ratio as well. So there is some kind of issues there with what size means, but yeah.
See Rob, who has a question?
Hey, Chris, really nice talk, very interesting results. That is a really simple question. I think you might have answered this in the talk, but I might have missed it. So when all is done, when you, in this figure you're showing right now, can you still explain the enhancement or the actual absorption by the core shell model, or do you need something different?
So I would say on the right-hand side of this, at the higher fullerene slip mass fractions, it seems like core shell works reasonably well. It's no better or worse than any of these other permutations in general. When you start to get to the left-hand side of that dashed line, then what we're postulating is that core shell works for the humidified state, kind of after activation or deliquescence. But before that, you can essentially treat it as externally mixed entirely, is what it seems like, that the black carbon lives so much on the surface of the overall particle that there's very small enhancement.
Okay, understood. So if you want to apply absorption in a global model,
Yeah,
we can still use core shell, right?
Yep.
To get the absolute amounts of absorption and scattering. Is that, yeah, okay.
I think for most cases, probably, because I think what we want to explore a bit more as well, these really small fullerene slip mass fractions, I don't think are all that common. Like when you look at kind of the observations of single particles and things like that, you tend to have at least 10%. So otherwise you have massive amounts of coating. So I don't think you end up on that what I'll call the less explainable or the harder to explain side of the graph in the atmosphere too often. But that's something where we want to explore also how general this is to particle generation methods and things like that too. Is this because we put these together in an aqueous solution, atomized it, and then dried it, and that had something to do, which then has some implications for because there's some cloud cycles, what happens when they dry out. But so we want to explore the space a bit more with some other systems.
Yeah, thank you.
So this is already 11. So let's thank our speaker one more time. And okay, it's gonna be on campus today. And if you have any question, I think Chris will be happy. As before, you will be happy to answer and discuss.